Record here.
Hit record and
Recording. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining our first Oregon Southwest Washington A4LE chapter webinar in this new world. My name's Eric Melly, and I'm the very recently elected president of the Oregon Southwest Washington chapter of A4LE. And before we get into John Mannix's very relevant presentation on reopening of schools during COVID-19, I want to take a moment to both thank our outgoing President Joe Echeverry and introduce our chapter's new board. For the past year, Joe has provided excellent leadership for our board and significantly expanded the attendance and networking opportunities of the monthly school tours. In addition to the tours, under Joe's leadership, we were able to expand our scholarship program to local school districts, increase our sponsorship and membership base, and provide our members with engaging networking events focused on upcoming school projects and modern school furnishings. I have big shoes to fill and will be looking forward to Joe's insight and expertise. Thanks, Joe. And as for this upcoming year, our board consists of myself, and then Glenn Pack of GBD Architects will be the president-elect. Eric Munson of Mannington will be our new secretary, replacing Tim Eiersman. Tim's been our secretary for 3 years, and Eric has a good resource in him. He's quite methodical and accurate in everything he does, and he's still here, so it's good. For at-large members, we have Lydia Burns, who's been on the board for quite a long time, Stephen Kelly, Robert Allen, who've both also been on the board for a long time, Nate Buttress, Charles Stiller, Tim has become an at-large member, and Jennifer Halleck here. And our governor is still Deb France. So without further ado, I'll let Jennifer introduce John and get this talk going.
awesome. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Just a little bit of housekeeping items before we turn it loose to John and he can impart all of his wisdom on us. I want to make sure that you mute your video or mute your speaker. You can keep your video up if you like. Sometimes it's nice to see people's facial expressions, but it's up to you. If you have a question at the end, please open up your video if you would. You don't have to, but that would be nice. We will take questions and Q&A and just some open dialogue at the end. We're going to record the presentation, and that's going to be posted on our chapter website around tomorrow morning sometime. That will become live. So if one of your coworkers missed the presentation and they'd like to catch up, they can watch it at a later time. As we're going through the presentation, and particularly at the end, if you want to kind of raise your hand in the chat room, we'll try to monitor that chat room so that we can keep track of what's happening and get your questions answered. And Q&A at the end. The one item that depending on how your Zoom is set up, if you're not able to see the presentation, if for some reason it doesn't show up large on your screen, if you were to hover over that presentation and right click, you'll be able to pin the video, and that will expand it larger on your screen. So if you're having trouble seeing the presentation when John gets started, give that technique a try and we'll see how it runs. So a little bit about John. John's currently the Director of Facilities for the Mukilteo School District. He has over 30 years experience managing school district facilities and operations for the Monroe, Kennewick, and Spokane school districts prior to joining Mukilteo. John is a current member and past board member of the Washington chapter of A4LE, and a former board member and past president of the Washington Association of Maintenance and Operations Administrators, and a longstanding member of the Technical Advisory Committee to the Office of to the Facilities and Organization Division of Washington State's Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. That is a big one, but they're kind of a big important entity for us here in Washington State. So without further ado, John has, talked to John briefly in June as they were working through some issues about reopening and what does this mean. He has some fantastic background and insights. So we're super excited to have John share that with us and catch his district's perspective. So with that, John, take it away.
Very good, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen here so that we can get the presentation there. Hopefully everybody sees that.
Fantastic.
Okay, so I'm going to try and give you an overview of some of the things that in most particular Mukilteo has been dealing with, but all school districts across Washington State, and I believe many other states as well, have been dealing with of late as we're looking to return to school this September. I'm going to talk briefly about hygiene and then move on to some instructional modalities that we're looking at, transportation issues, some health screening requirements, physical distancing in our schools, feeding kids, cleaning and disinfecting, and a few other types of concerns as well. And then happy to answer any questions when we get to the end here. So starting with hygiene, it's really not all that different from what you are doing in your homes and when you go out to the store or in your places of work, with a few exceptions. So obviously hand washing is a huge issue, and we want the students to be able to wash hands before meals and snacks and after recess and after touching their face, so on and so forth. The problem with that is most schools have one sink in a classroom and limited sinks in and around commons and cafeterias. So that might be something to take a look at for the future. I'm not envisioning that this particular pandemic is the last pandemic we'll ever see in our lifetimes, and so some more hand washing stations would be very helpful. Washing hands out in a portable or modular classroom structure where there is no sink and no running water. Obviously, that's not an easy situation. And some of the portable hand washing stations are either extremely costly, or even if you can afford those, they have to be filled with water, and then the gray water has to be emptied. Again, there isn't running water out there or sewer to connect them to, so that's very time consuming and labor intensive. Don't touch your face. Can you imagine that with 5 to 9-year-olds all day long in school? So that's going to be an interesting challenge for our instructional staff. And then wearing a face cover is going to be a requirement initially. And younger students don't typically do well with a mask across their face. So we're looking at it, the primary grades, kindergarten through 2nd grade, and special needs students with a shield instead of a face mask, and that's going to be difficult enough. And then students from about 3rd grade and up wearing a face mask of some type. So those things are going to be critical to be able to return kids to schools. Let's talk about instruction for a minute. There's 3 primary modalities that we're really taking a look at right now. And one we'll call a rotating schedule. Another is a phased-in opening, and then continuous learning or online learning. So let me go over each one of those just briefly. A split or a rotating schedule. About half the students are in school in any given day. The other half of the students are working at home online. They could be video conferencing in and following along with their teacher and classmates, or they could be working in their learning management system, doing other assignments and lessons. They could be doing computer adaptive assignments or assessments, many things of that nature. And then the next day would, obviously, the students who were at home would come in and be in class, and the students who'd been in class would be at home, distance learning. So the benefit is, of course, half the students are in school at any given moment in time, which makes it a lot easier to provide that physical distancing, which we'll get into a little bit later in the presentation. It also provides a consistent schedule for families and students and childcare. So everybody knows which day they're going to be in class and which day they're not, so that those things can be accommodated. And I've just shown a little graphic here of what that might look like. You notice that the teacher prep day, and we've talked about, do students learn all 5 days? There's probably going to be some assignments for students, for the learners and scholars on the teacher prep day, excuse me. But teacher prep day is Wednesday. And you might find this a little humorous, hopefully. We started out looking at Friday as the teacher prep day, and then quickly realized if we had no students and no lessons, we might not have any teachers paying attention either. So we moved that to Wednesday. So anyway, I'll move on.
That was fun.
Phased reopening is another approach, and that's where certain groups of students would be in the classroom, in school. Students with greater need for that direct interaction and for more time with the teacher. So again, some of our younger learners, and particularly students with special needs that would be better served under those circumstances, would be in school. While again, other students who might not have those same needs would be accommodated to a greater degree online with either a split schedule or something else of that nature. So again, we're looking at this for particularly kindergarten through 2nd grade, although what Mukilteo is working very diligently to do is actually have all elementary age students in school 5 days a week. We're not sure we can accomplish that yet, and we may have to fall back to a phased reopening with hopefully kindergarten through 4th, if not K through 5 or kindergarten through 3rd. But a little more time will tell us exactly what's going to happen in that regard. The other alternative, of course, is distance learning. And we're seeing already that many school districts are making that choice right now, while the rates, the COVID positive test results and rates are still high and in fact increasing in many areas. So this means that 100% of the students would be working online from home, doing those same types of activities that I'd mentioned previously. Maybe, in addition to that, some discussion boards and team spaces and other things of that nature, but all the instruction for the predominant portion of students would be done in an online environment. There's benefits to that in terms of the students and families and our teachers not being exposed to one another, and then, reducing significantly the potential for exposure to the infection. It certainly reduces the amount of fear and worry by both parents and staff members. The detriment is it's generally recognized as not being the best instructional modality, that having kids in school with the teacher is better in terms of the instruction and in student achievement, student retention, student engagement. So it's not the ideal solution, but it is one, as I said, that many school districts are going to initially, at least, until things stabilize a little bit further. So taking a look at those 3 modes, there's some commonality. One of them is for whatever portion of time, either full-time or part of the time that a student is working at home, they still need to have a device that they can work on. And sometimes having one computer in a family of 4 or 5, if you've got 3 or 4 students, that may not be sufficient. And especially if mom or dad is trying to work from home these days, or spending more time at home than they had previously as part of their job, more devices for the students was ideal. So many school districts are rolling out student devices of one type or another. The other issue, of course, is does the family have broadband connectivity? And we and other school districts are finding that that is not the case for 100% of the families. And so then helping them to get some connectivity, helping them to get connected to Comcast or Frontier or Verizon or somebody else who can provide them a low-cost alternative if they're in a particular socioeconomic status, or even providing Wi-Fi cellular, Wi-Fi hotspots for families in need is what many school districts are undertaking at this time. And if all that fails, then what? The then what is that student has to operate in a pen and pencil and paper mode, and our teachers have to accommodate that because it is a requirement that each child will have a essentially similar learning experience. And if that can't be provided in an online fashion in the digital world, it must be provided in a pencil and paper fashion. And that complicates things, obviously, for the teacher when that has to occur. Additionally, some things are just really difficult in the COVID world. Books can no longer be shared as readily. Libraries, we're struggling to determine whether libraries can and should continue, especially in the same fashion. They cannot, we know that. Check out a book. When that book comes back, it has to be treated as infected. Obviously, you can't, douse paper with disinfectant to cure that situation, so it has to be set aside for a period of time so that it's decontaminated simply through time. Manipulatives in the classroom are another issue. Many teachers have a lot of things in the classroom. Some of them are more recreational or games for rewards, but many of them go with the curriculum. They're math manipulatives and science materials and other things of that nature. They have to be provided individually for each student and kept apart, so each student has their own, or they have to be sanitized between uses, between one user and another. So again, that's very much complicates the classroom and the operation of the classroom to have to deal with those circumstances. Moving on to transportation, that's created a whole series of issues of its own. When we take a look at parent pickup and drop-off, that has been highly problematic for many years already. There's been a growing trend in the last 10 or 15 years. More parents are taking their kids to school and picking them up from school than ever before. And that's likely to increase even further with a situation like the COVID-19 pandemic in place. So we're going to see more vehicles coming to the schools, which means parking's more crowded. Those pickup and drop-off lines are much more likely to back up into surrounding streets and roadways. We're also required to keep any family that gets out of the vehicle, any students that are coming to us or waiting in line for their parent to come pick them up, separated and 6 feet apart. So we're going to need signage and much larger waiting areas. And of course, not all those waiting areas are covered by a nice awning or overhang in our wonderful Pacific Northwest environment. So that liquid sunshine is an issue that is going to have to be dealt with. I don't know, it can be addressed in a physical format, but unfortunately that means kids are going to get wet under those circumstances. And it also requires a lot more staff to be able to manage those students and the traffic flows and keep students separated. Another issue, school buses themselves. Take a typical school bus that the designers say is a 77 or 78 passenger bus. And you can get pretty close to that with the younger grades, with primary grades. But middle school, high school, they're typically going to carry 54, 55 students at a maximum. If we were to have to keep students separated with the 6-foot physical distancing requirements, that would mean about 12 of those students would be able to be on a bus at any time. Somebody somewhere recognized that that was not feasible, that we weren't going to suddenly be able to come up with 4 to 5 times as many school buses. And even if we could find the buses or afford the buses, we wouldn't have enough drivers. Most school districts struggle to keep all their drivers and a few subs at any given moment in time, so that wasn't very feasible. Nor is it feasible to take 4 or 5 times as many routes. Usually, morning and afternoon, there's 2 sets of routes. The same bus and driver will go out and pick up secondary students and drop them off at the middle schools and high schools, and then go back out on that same route or a very substantially similar route to pick up the elementary age students and take them to one or more elementary schools. And of course, that is replicated in the afternoon again for taking all those students home. So adding more routes isn't really feasible and still providing a school day for students. So the only real solution to that situation was simply to mask up kids, put them in masks, put them in face shields, and put them on the bus. The idea being that they're not on the bus 6.5, 7 hours a day. It's a shorter period of time. Most routes are 30 to 45 minutes. It will be interesting to see how that works with all those students in masks and or shields. And I'd like you to think about driving a 35 foot long vehicle with 40 or 50 kids on it, and you're in a mask or you're in a face shield. And those of you that wear glasses as I do, think about that while wearing a mask while driving a bus full of these kids. It's going to be some interesting times. What we're doing is getting face shields instead of a mask to try and prevent some of that fogging. The recommendations are that we keep the windows open as much as possible, which will work for some portions of the year, weather dependent, and encourage walking, bike riding, and being driven by parents. And that takes us back to the previous slide, which that has some problems of its own that will likely to be exacerbated by this whole pandemic situation. Moving on to health screening, because that's going to be another issue. I'm going to talk about it here, but this has to be done actually before at school for any student that rides a bike, walks, or parent is dropping them off. And it has to be done by the bus driver or a bus aide before the student gets on a bus for any students being transported by our yellow fleet. And it's the same thing you're used to. It's, do you have a temperature, symptoms such as cough or shortness of breath, sore throat, those types of things? Have you been exposed to somebody? Obviously, we can't ask a kindergartner these kinds of things. So really what we have to be doing is asking parents, and therefore we have to set up either a paper process or online process for parents to certify their child's health each and every day before they can attend class. We have to separate out any child whose parents have not yet certified them for that day, and then make contact with the parents to get that to happen or to have the child taken back home. And when you think about the enrollment of a typical school, 450 to 650 students at the elementary, 1,500 to 1,850 at a high school in our region. There's certainly schools that are smaller than that and schools that are larger, but that's kind of typical in Washington and in our area. Even if half of those students are showing up, you have somewhere between 250 and, 700, 800 students, 900 students potentially, depending on the school, that all have to be certified before they're supposed to be allowed in the door. And that's every morning before school can start. Physical distancing is another issue, and we've been doing a lot of work with that the last couple of weeks, taking a look at how we can set up our classrooms to accommodate physical distancing. Because even if we start in a 100% online environment, we may come back to having kids in school at some point through the school year. Because again, that distance learning is not the most ideal situation for ongoing and continuous learning. So here's, this actually is a little, not our typical classroom in Mukilteo or school districts that I've been involved with, or many that I know, but you have to go with what graphics you can find. So our typical classrooms, primary grades, kindergarten through 2, are 18 to 22 students, intermediate grades 3 through 5, 24 to 28, and secondary grades, usually 28 to 32, maybe 34. Unfortunately, with the situation with the pandemic and physical distancing, those numbers shift quite readily. It's still a little surprising that we're getting up to 18 and 19 in some instances, depending on the dimensions of the room, where the door, where the sink are located, where the teaching wall is, whether there's a large display panel or whiteboards, and where the teacher's desk is. We're finding that we can hit these numbers of 15 to 18 and 16 to 19 and still maintain that 6-foot physical distance. So that works well with the split or rotating schedules, or even with the upper grades with some of the other models that we can at least get half the kids into a class, or a little bit more than half. However, if we're getting only a little bit more than half, we have to add some additional classrooms. So we're looking at that as well, adding classrooms in spaces, whether it's a music room or something that used to be a dedicated resource room, or occupational therapy, physical therapy, Title Lab, ELL. Other programs of that nature may have to move into libraries or smaller spaces so we can set up those larger areas for students, even to be able to accommodate half of them at a time. Other issues with physical distancing, a lot of the lower grades, kindergarten, first, second, have, maybe 6 tables in the room. Each table was supposed to, typically accommodates 4 students, and so you get your seating for 24. Well, with physical distancing, those 6 tables now seat 6, which is a big issue. So we're having to mix and match tables and student desks, bringing desks from upper grades and then dropping them down a little bit on hopefully adjustable legs when they have them, and taking some of the tables and moving them to some of the upper grades to infill a little bit so that we have enough student desks and or tables to accommodate the students that we need to have in class at any given moment in time. Because even though we don't have as many students in each classroom, we have more classrooms to be able to accommodate the entire student enrollment. So that's been a big jigsaw puzzle that we're working our way through right now, and my teams are out in our schools actually doing that physical setup. Again, we have to act like we're going to start with school in session in our buildings in September, whether we do or not, or we will never be prepared. And once we get them set up, we'll be ready for later in the year. If they come back after winter break in January to the schools, we'll have the rooms set up and ready to go. So that work is underway right now. Finally, some other things. So I think it's particularly important. I love the look on these kids' face, and I think these things that I'm on this slide are just going to exacerbate that situation of boredom and inattention, because there's no longer any field trips. There's no longer any assemblies, either for instruction and learning or large gatherings for school spirit and such. Not likely to be choir or band, because you can't sing and you can't play many musical instruments without having a mask off, and you're breathing harder, and that causes more air movement and more spittle, to be quite blunt. And so those things are just not going to be happening. Recess isn't going to be recess. If we have such a thing, it's going to be a modified PE, because we're not able to have PE in a lot of the physical activities. So it's going to be a structured play. PE and athletics are going to be reduced or eliminated, and especially the ones that have a lot of physical contact initially. Passing periods may look different. Certainly large groups of kids gathering together and socializing in the hall is very much a norm in a school environment, and we're not going to be able to allow that kind of thing. So much of what kids do in school that they enjoy aren't going to be possible as we move forward. And so that's going to be a struggle for teachers and for our students. Let's talk about meal service for a few moments. That's another interesting one. So a couple of these pictures here, we typically have 2 or 3 lunch periods a day, each accommodating 300 to 400 students. That is going to have to change. We can't have as many students in a cafeteria. The upper picture has tables for about 6. The lower picture has the folding tables with integrated seats that hold about 12. With physical distancing, the round tables with the blue seats, if they're a 6-foot table, you might be able to get 2 students there. Might be for 1 if it's a slightly smaller table. And the big bench seating down there, the individual seats with the longer tables, maximum of 3 instead of 12. So we're gonna have to look at alternatives. Either we need more lunches with smaller groups of students, or we have to flip things and start feeding in the classroom. And that means either students have to be released a class or 2 at a time to come down to the kitchen and get their meal and go back, and they have to maintain the physical distancing while that's occurring. or we have to deliver meals to the classroom, which means we have to keep the food warm if it's warm food while it's being delivered, and it takes additional staffing to be able to make those deliveries. And then hopefully you'll see the humor in this next slide, because feeding kids in the classroom just makes me shudder. Many of our elementary schools and a number of our secondary schools have carpet for the flooring surface in the classrooms. And if you can imagine all the spills from milk to juice to spaghetti sauce and everything else that happens in a cafeteria on a given day, and then having that happen in classrooms, we're going to have to spend significantly more time paying attention to the cleanliness of those classrooms and making sure they stay healthy environments. But even on a vinyl or a rubber floor, which is a lot easier to clean up than a carpeted floor, those students are going to be spread out into 30 to 80 different areas across the building instead of concentrated in one area in the commons or a multipurpose room. And so the cleaning time, even though it's the same, the same number of kids, is going to be significantly greater simply because it's stretched out so much farther. So that's an impact to our custodial services. Cleaning and disinfecting is another area. And I'm sure many of you are going through similar things, or at least have given some thought to this. But one of my worries is how much chemical. Disinfectants are by their very nature toxic chemicals. Doesn't kill virus and bacteria if it's not harmful and toxic to some degree. The hydrogen peroxide and the alcohol-based products are deemed to be the most safe, and so that's what we're concentrating on and utilizing. And a lot of people are buying a lot of devices to aerosolize a fine mist or fog of a chemical disinfectant. Personally, I see those as kind of a something that is good in hospitals and labs where there's the kind of environment that truly requires it, or for emergency situations. If we have a staff member or a student that is determined to have a positive COVID situation, then we might use those devices. But those fine mists mean quality training, and the proper PPE must be utilized. And of these two pictures, I think it's kind of two ends of the spectrum. One individual is wearing what I consider to be appropriate PPE and utilizing the system, in an appropriate fashion, apparently has received the proper training. The other individual, I would say, is not, and is jeopardizing their own health. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that all school districts would follow, and all custodians, frankly, the more desirable model in the upper picture. So that's a concern. And then just having all that additional chemical in an environment where students are going to be touching things gives me some concern for those that have multiple chemical sensitivities or react to chemical in the environment, which is roughly 10% of the population these days, but can be even more than that in the younger population. And then, of course, every disinfectant has a specific wet contact or dwell time that has to be maintained to be effective. So even though you spray something or fog something, has each surface where a virus or bacteria potentially been dwelling remained wet for that dwell time so that it is eradicated effectively. So lots of things to be thinking about there. And then some other concerns just in general that we're taking a look at and trying to discern. Physical distancing, physical barriers. Lots of folks, including we, are buying polycarbonate or plexiglass panels or partitions to put them up around certain folks' workstations, particularly in offices and counseling offices, main offices, other areas where there's a lot of walk-up traffic. We're looking at signage and putting signage in place and things to help maintain physical distancing while students or staff are waiting in line, or folks are waiting to get up to that counter to have an interaction with school staff. We're looking at our ventilation, opening up outside air dampers to bring in more fresh outside air and have more air exchanges per hour than has been the case previously. And of course, that will have some adverse implications on our utility bills. We're also looking at our ventilation system filters and moving to at least a MERV 13 filter, because that's where the filter media starts actually becoming effective against things as small a size as a virus or bacteria. Unfortunately, some of the older equipment wasn't ever designed to utilize filters of that nature. And so we're trying to be very careful and do some testing and find out how much that impedes airflow and what equipment may be able to actually operate with that, and what equipment it might be either a little dangerous or could cause some problems. Obviously, if the filter collapses, it's not filtering and not doing its job. And if the motor burns out, that's not a good situation either. So we're looking at those very carefully. And then some other things, staff concerns, professional development. Are they ready for online learning as a much larger component, or maybe the sole component of instruction for some months to come? Performing the wide variety of different diagnostics and screenings that are required of elementary age students, and even a bit beyond that, is going to be interesting in an online environment. Behavioral supports, the teacher can't walk up and have physical proximity to a student who's misbehaving on a Zoom session. And so, how the teachers are going to need some new tools to be able to manage students in that kind of environment. And obviously our teachers are also worried about their own personal safety and health. And so that is an issue of concern. From student and family perspectives, we've heard homework is an issue. How many teachers are assigning how much homework each night, and trying to coordinate that so it's reasonable. Scheduling the synchronous time. If a teacher is having a live session where he or she wants all the students to be involved and online simultaneously, our teachers scheduling those at similar times so that one teacher is having a session while another teacher is having a session as well. It's hard for a student to be in two places at once, even in a digital world. Social emotional needs of students and the overall mental health and well-being of students when they're not interacting. A lot of our teachers are pretty good at picking up on some of those things when they're in the environment with the student. Will that be as easy? Will it be as apparent when the student is operating in that digital world? Supporting transitions from one to another teaching modality. Whatever we start with, it may change at some point in time. If we start online, we hope to come back to school in the classroom somewhere during the school year. If we start with school in the schoolhouse and then have a positive case crop up, will we revert back to an online learning for a period of time or not? So just wanting to make sure we understand what students and families need during those transitions. Other things such as loss of student voice and family engagement in that digital world, all are concerns that we're having much conversation with and trying to resolve. And then finally, we're getting tons and tons of guidance. We're having lots of information provided to us. That information is coming from a wide variety of sources, from a national level to state level to county, local level. And school districts are surveying parents, surveying staff, having conversations with their bargaining units, formulating committees to review all these types of questions and many, many more that I just didn't have time to even begin to go into in a brief presentation of this nature. Trying to put together the best information they can to come up with a plan. We all must have a return to school plan that has to be turned into OSPI. And that plan should be responsive to the unique needs of each community and will, in fact, be unique because of the unique needs of each community and school district. So it's not really a cookie cutter. It's a very unique plan that each school district, there'll be similarities, there'll be some commonality, but it will be unique for each school district as we all come up with our own plan for how to return to school and educate kids. So that was a brief whirlwind tour of some of the things we're thinking about and some of the work we've been undertaking. So I'm happy to elaborate on any of that or try and answer any questions I can and give you even additional information.
Thanks, John. Oh my goodness, there's so much to do for schools over this summer, quote, summertime break.
Yeah, and the days are ticking down and we're all getting more and more harried and panicked by the day.
Yes, yeah. So, folks, if you want to turn your video on and ask any questions of John, I'll start off with a question. John, when do all the school districts need to provide the plan to their communities and submit their plan to OSPI?
Yeah. Well, the sooner the better would be my answer for the communities, because of course parents are wondering and our staff is wondering and wants all the answers sooner rather than later. OSPI's requirement is 2 weeks before the first day of instruction. So from their perspective, we could wait depending on when the school district is going to start school, of course. For many school districts, that's middle of August. For a few, that's earlier, and for a few, it might be a little later. But every day that goes, my opinion is every day we go farther into August, we're going to get more and more pressure from our community members and parents and staffs to provide those answers and provide that.
Do you have in Mukilteo, do you have a community approach to the decision about your school schedule and what's happening? And like, is the Department of Health involved in that? Or are you guys pretty much doing that as just the school district? Or how are you coming up with the determining factors?
We've used a number of different processes. First of all, we have, I don't remember the exact number, but I think we have either 7 or 8 different committees, each one looking at a unique and specific facet of school. So there's one around facilities, and there's one around the instructional modality, and those types of things. And there's parent or representatives on those committees as well. We have used surveys of both staff and our families. We have an online thought exchange process that we've been utilizing, as well as individual surveys sent, available online or sent out via email. So we've been gathering all that information from our constituents here, as well as taking a look at all the guidance that's provided by OSPI, the Governor's Office, State Department of Health, Snohomish County Health Department. And Snohomish County Health did just come out with some new and updated guidance. And we had heard that was coming. CDC as well has come out with some updated guidance, and we knew that was going to be forthcoming. So our superintendent and board made the decision they wanted to wait until those things were available. We have the surveys in hand and have had for a week or so and have been looking at those results. The thought exchange had wrapped up about 10 days ago. So we've got all that information now that we're overlaying with the most latest the guidance from Snohomish County Health Department and CDC to see where that leaves us. And we will find out here. Well, it's after 5 now, so I guess I can actually tell you, because I was prohibited from speaking about this until 5 o'clock. But Mukilteo School District has made the decision just today that we will be starting 100% online.
So will you be then requiring the teachers to come into the classroom to teach online from their physical classrooms, or are you going to allow teachers to continue to teach from home, or how will the teachers sort of feel? And then the second part of that question is, how does the teachers union feel about all of that? I'm sure you've heard from them.
We did hear from the bargaining unit, and it was certainly the desire of the teachers union to start online as well. They understand that that's not the best mode for instruction in the long term, but right now, while the numbers are high and continuing to climb, they make a good point that it's very important that everybody does everything possible to ensure that we're not transmitting the infection from one to another and get to the point where we can turn that around and those numbers go down so we can, again, bring students back to school in a safe fashion. And as far as, I'm sorry, I think I lost track of the first part of that question, Jennifer. Sorry.
Will your teachers be required to come into the building to class?
They're not going to the best of my knowledge, and that is something that the instructional committee has been wrestling with, and I haven't heard an absolute final decree on that yet. But all the conversation has been that as long as the teacher has adequate technology to be able to provide that instruction from home, that they would be allowed to do so. We are, however, preparing all the classrooms for the eventual return, as well as many teachers will likely want to come in, because we've got the big 75-inch Promethean active panels and, other technologies and things in the classroom, from web cameras to document cameras, plus many of their instructional materials. So it might be easier for many to be in their classroom and provide that instruction. So that's what we're working to be able to enable for
them. John, this is Tim Erisman. I'm with Oak Planning and Design. I have a question in regards to the younger students, K through 5. There's a development that's important with them and other students, learning how to interact with kids, that I haven't heard much discussion, especially with a lot of the schools going with the all online. Have you heard the discussion about the all online and how, or if there's anything they're doing about that development aspect?
I haven't been involved in those particular committees. That's not my area of expertise, but that is widely recognized as one of the problems with 100% online instruction. And I know that our instructional group and our instructional leaders are having those conversations about how do we meet those social needs, the emotional needs, those learning needs of those younger individuals in an online environment. And that is, again, one of the reasons that although we may start that way, it is not the desire of the district as a whole, the leadership of the district and the board, that we continue in that vein. So I can try and find a little bit more information if you'd like and forward it on, but I know that has been a very serious part of the conversation that's taken place.
That'd be great. Anything that you do find out would be great to hear.
Hey, John, this is Joe. And thanks for the presentation. It was really great. I'm curious if, one of the things that we, as an organization, have been really interested in is resiliency. And I'm curious what lessons learned you're taking from this and how in the long term, even after this pandemic ends, what things you might see moving forward, both in your buildings and in other aspects.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a number of things. First of all, I think everything we're learning, we're going to have to put in writing, put in a binder, stick on the shelf, if you will. Now that may be a digital binder instead of a real one, but I think all the things we're doing now is going to have value in retaining those lessons learned, because I don't know that this will be the last time in our lives that we have a pandemic of some nature that we'll have to deal with. I think there are things that we're learning. Certainly, we're going to learn a great deal about instruction in terms of the digital world and trying to make that better and more effective, even though that's not the way we want or envision education continuing. I think we're learning a great deal about, health, and not just in schools, but as a society. Some of the things that we need to be concerned with and some of the things that will be changing over time. One possible, positive benefit that's come from this, I'm not sure that any school district will need to reserve snow days for the future. Because if you have a snow day, if you have a school who, somebody smashes into a pole and takes out the electrical. You have a main water line break. You can't hold school for a day. It'll be much easier now to flip to that digital environment for a day or two to resolve that issue, and then flip right back into, instruction back in the school building face to face. I think there are a number of things, and right now, I believe we're so wrapped up in trying to solve problems, we haven't spent enough time really thinking about what we've learned and how it might help us and improve things, or how we might use the things we've learned in the longer term. So I hope you'll forgive me that I don't have a ton of answers to that at the moment. We're still scrambling right now. But I think a few months farther down the line, I'd be happy to come back and have some additional conversation about that, because I think once we slow down a little bit and can actually concentrate on questions of that nature, we'll be able to come up with and articulate much better other things that will come out of this that may benefit us in the long run.
John, this is Randall Heeb at Opsis Architecture. When you were looking at this AB schedule, you've got it Monday, Tuesday, AB. We've been talking about it. Do you do 2 days in a row, have your in-between day, then 2 days in a row for the B team, just to reduce that day-to-day contamination and maybe ease the amount of deep cleaning? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, we did. We've had conversations of that nature, and really the needs of the kids and instruction kind of overrode that. We could not actually envision that there would be no need to disinfect. In other words, going 2 days as a block and then flipping really doesn't reduce the custodial load. The general cleaning still has to take place. We're still required, to disinfect all the restrooms and all the health rooms and, anything of that nature, from locker rooms to, wrestling mats or whatever may be in use at whatever moment in time they're in use. And in the classroom, it just didn't seem to be the greatest factor to weigh. It was really what was best for instruction and best to meet the needs of kids that outweighed that as a potential. So we ended up with the AB alternating days. Doesn't mean it's the right decision for everybody. Somebody else could use those block days, and somebody else somewhere could go a week at a time and flip every other week instead of, every day or a couple of times during the week.
Makes sense. Maybe a little bit of a follow-up is I hear a lot of conversations for the older students, high school, about instead of carrying 7, 8 classes at a time for the whole year, maybe you focus just on a couple at a time and reduce the number of transitions they have to make. Have you thought about that? And interestingly, might that be an educational model that allows students, that goes into the future, like that might be a better way to learn in the future?
Yes, actually, I think there's a very real potential that might be the case. We have already announced that we'll be using kind of a block schedule, as it's being called. Although in this case, let's say, 8th grade math. 8th grade math won't be across multiple semesters, a year-long course to get your credit, or half credit per semester. It will be a longer 80 to 90 minute block class instead of the typical 50 to 55 minute class. And the credit will be achieved within that one semester. So we are looking at those things. It does mean that typical secondary school students will not be taking 6 courses simultaneously. They'll be taking 3. And then the next semester, 3 different courses, obviously. So they'll get the same credits for completing the class, but they just won't take a year to complete. It'll be 6 months. The biggest issue is those classes that never stretched across a year, that were just a semester long. And so that's going to take some manipulation and thinking to determine, how that will work. But yes, you're absolutely right. Good catch on that one. And I think it may well continue well past this pandemic situation. I think once the teachers get used to it and the kids see what it is, I think I'm not the instructor, I'm not the educator, so we'll have to see. My opinion is it should go over well, but
Do we have any other questions for John? We've almost come to the end of our hour together, but if anyone has any other questions, please, while we have John here with his expertise, if there's any curiosity, even if it's coming from a place of, hey, in my household, I'm hearing this, please feel free to ask the questions. I think everyone's hungry, John. It's 5:30. Yeah. We have no social appetizers to share with people. We have no social drinks to share afterwards, which I'm missing in our chapter experience after having successful happy hours with one another for years. So we're going to maybe have our own happy hour independently afterwards. Nice. All right, you guys. Thank you, John. This was really great. If you don't mind, we're going to post your contact information along with the recording, and we'll we might have some follow-up questions from some people for you about school and opening and best practice, because we're just so lucky to have you share, having been a part of the OSPI special group of individuals, I guess, who helped facilitate some of the early discussions around COVID and school closing and opening, and then now putting it into practice. It's just very, very invaluable for us. So thank you very much.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm glad to have done it. Hopefully there were a few tidbits everybody gleaned from this. It's been a mad, crazy few months since March. So anyway, happy to answer any questions or respond to emails anybody might like. So
thank you.
You bet.
All right. Well, if we had a toast, we could toast here. Cheers to our kickoff of our A4LE year, and sure hope to see you all in person at some point soon.